Femicide, violence against women, it has to stop. 9 million European women report they are victims of violence. This week in European Parliament, MEPs met with civil society representatives from Europe and Latin America. Their message was, together we can end violence against women. Today on EBX News, we're joined by Luz Mejia, coordinator of the Organization of American States, and Catalan MEP Raúl Romeva. Raúl, welcome. This conference, what's the objective?
What is the seventh conference of cycle that we started in 2006. We started discussing the feminicide in the parliament. That was the first time that we raised the issue. We understood that there was a lack of attention, both politically and also institutionally, to that situation that not only occurs in Central America and Latin America in general, but is also an European phenomenon. And in that sense, what we are trying to do every year is to remind ourselves, but also the institutions, that this is something that needs to be addressed politically, economically, even in terms of policies and judicial terms. So in that sense, the conference tomorrow is a new step in order to have this universal dimension of the feminicides, the killing of women for the simple reason of being a woman, and that remind us as well that this is not something that it does not occur in Europe. We have in Europe a huge problem on feminicides as well, and that's what we want to remind everybody.
Okay, Luz, what do you want to get out of this conference?
Yo creo que lo principal que hay que señalar en este espacio y compartir en este espacio.
I think the main issue to point out and share here is that feminicide is not only a phenomenon in Latin America, but also in Europe with very similar causes and consequences. From Latin America, we have experience evaluating the situation, and we believe we can contribute to the discussion process. Participate in all issues related to the Istanbul Convention, and this will bring similar situations and perspectives closer on what's happening here, specifically feminicide.
Okay, the similarities that you mentioned in terms of violence, but the similarities pretty much stop there when it comes to legislation as well. What do you think that Latin America can learn from the European system at the moment?
Latin America has been part of the Convention of Belém do Pará for 20 years. 20 years assessing public policies. 20 years assessing how well the laws that have been created in relation to the Convention of Belém do Pará have functioned. And 20 years putting under the magnifying glass the mistakes that have been made, not allowing progress on specific figures. For instance, with regard to the causes and numbers of actual feminicide that occur in the region on one hand, and on the other hand, which policies were applied at the time and did not work to transform the culture of male chauvinism and patriarchy. These are elements that we think we can bring into the discussion that is taking place in Europe with regard to the phenomenon of feminicide.
Okay, Raúl, the culture has to change in general, but the political culture is pretty slow moving when it comes to this. How do we see the objectives of tomorrow translated into a political and legislative reality?
There are different levels. Some are, let's say, national levels. So at the national level, we have very different situations, not only in between Europe and Latin America, but also within Europe. We have different realities, different legislations, different frames that we need to assess. One common aspect in both realities, actually worldwide, is the fact that we lack data. Correct data. That's something that needs to be solved. If we don't have a correct data, if we don't really know what we talk about, if we don't specify what are the type of crimes that we have to confront with, we don't know how to react to them. And that's a problem all over, not only in Latin America, but also in Europe. So the first step, we need to know what is going on, and that means that we need to spend money on knowing this. Research, making also assistance and giving support to all those organizations that are working on the field, on gathering data, knowing what are the causes in some realities which are specific to that reality, to that situation. And obviously there are some structural situations that need to be addressed, so data and knowledge, that's the first thing. The second thing, the step of fighting impunity. One big difference among different states is the fact that in some situations you might have the feeling that there is more problems than others. And what it happens is that it's simply more visible. than in other situations. Impunity is something that, if it's not addressed, is a catalyst in order to give the problem keep going. Impunity in some countries in Latin America arrives even to the 99%, and I'm not exaggerating. The fact that you have no responsible for most of the crimes that happen there is something outrageous. The difference might be that in Europe you have most cases that are at least judged, prosecuted. So you know who is the responsible and you prosecute the responsible. That's something that needs to be acquired everywhere. And the third step that I find absolutely important as a consequence of this, if we don't address not only legislatively, but also in terms of the whole holistic process, culturally, education, structurally, economically, socially, the whole dimension that evolves the principle of patriarchy, as Luz mentioned, the problem is not going to be solved. We're not talking only about one full man killing a woman. We're talking about a systemic problem. And it's as a system that needs to be changed. So that's, to me, the main three issues that needs to be solved.
Okay, Luz, it was seen that the democratic system goes hand in hand with the legislative system, the legal process. How do you implement stronger laws in Latin America? Are there good examples in different regions which this is working better than others, which you can use as a role model?
Sí, en toda Latinoamérica.
Yes, throughout Latin America, let's say in the Americas, 32 countries are part of the Convention of Belém do Pará, and all the states have some type of law or public policy that tends to protect women from violence. Some experiences are better than others. For example, we have laws that have developed a higher level of protection because the violence is not only domestic or family violence, which is obviously where most cases of feminicide happen, but also there are other types of violence that have not been diagnosed several years ago. For 10 years, we have been making the distinction that domestic violence exists not only in the private sphere, but also in the public sphere, and that has allowed us to make progress in the definition of feminicide. So we could say that there are countries that have made progress. They have made progress in laws with a greater degree of protection. Sure, there is a problem of impunity. Sure, there is a problem that has to do with judicial stereotypes that are operating when a case reaches the judges. But for example, we have countries with very high rates of violence, and they are developing specialized courts on the subject, like Venezuela and Guatemala, which are developing a broad jurisdiction on issues of violence against women and especially courts of feminicide. We don't necessarily have that much time to evaluate. We haven't had enough time to assess the efficiency of the implementation of specialized courts of justice, because we have the problem of how to reflect data. We have the problem of how to reflect if it was or not a feminicide, whether it was a violent death of a woman for being a woman, or if it is a case unrelated to the patriarchal system. That is a problem in the region. We have, as I mentioned previously, specialized courts. We have also made decisions at high levels, and for example in Latin America, all Supreme Courts currently have an office specialized in gender issues that allow a more comprehensive approach to access justice for women victims of violence and for relatives of victims of feminicide.
Okay. The issues that we have in Europe, one country does not perceive it, violence against women, as another region, even within the same country, does. The cultural examples that we have from Latin America are diverse. Within Europe, they're diverse as well. This is a big political challenge to get some agreement coming out of the European Union on this. And you're dealing with a gender issue as well, where a large part of the electorate is just simply not engaged in this idea of protecting women. They see it as, why does the normal law not protect it anyway? So how do you join all these dots? What's the driving force that stops this being a women's issue and becomes a justice issue?
Well, women's rights is a human right And in that sense, from that principle, it needs to be focused that way. If you are aware of the fact that one person, because he's black, and he's being attacked because he's black, and there is a racism principle behind that violence, and you understand that this is, in most of the cases, no, not only, but in some cases this is clear, in most of the cases it occurs the same with women. And the fact is that we need to understand that when we talk about the cultural dimension behind this, cultural is something that is a dynamic concept. Is not, in some cases what I have perceived is that as an excuse. Some say, well, you know, the culture here is to treat women that way. Well, that's a completely unacceptable principle, because we know from whole history that culture can evolve. In that sense, when we tackle from the European perspective all this issue, is important that we realize that when in many cases the fact that we have women as the victims of a murder is not simply because they were in that place. Most of the times it's because they were in that place for a reason. The dependency of the murderer is also caused by the economical situation or by the socio-economic situation that we have to confront with. So this is one thing that makes the women weaker or more dependent on the men, and which makes that the violence against women is something that is structural, is not only something circumstantial. The third aspect that to me is important as well is this patriarchal perception. Women are something that belong to men, and that needs to be changed. And it's not only a question of direct violence. Sometimes it's simply a question of messages, stereotypizations, all this global dimension that makes that most of the times women are perceived as something inferior to men. That is a problem in Latin America, but it is a problem as well in Europe. It's not a problem that has to do with a specific culture, let's say. So in that sense, there are a lot of things that are common. The difference might be the legal frames, which doesn't mean that in Latin America are worse necessarily than in Europe. In some countries in Latin America, they have better legislation than we have in some countries in Europe. So in that sense, I also try to make the comparison in terms of not only is the text, the legal text, what matters, is also the implementation of that text.
There we have it. The issues on the table relate to everyone, not just to women. And the question that Europe has to answer is, what's it going to do next? Is it going to be more creative? Is it going to use cultural exchange? Is it going to use trade to advance the facilities available to women to develop their businesses so they can find a way out of poverty, to advance the justice system to find their way out of impunity? And will we learn these lessons for ourselves? Will we bring the lessons back home from the conference tomorrow and begin to apply them across the regions of Europe? More justice for women comes on the back of trade as well. This is something we've discussed here today. Thank you to our guests Luz and Raul. Good night.